Okay, so I think we're all set here. So the purpose why we're here, right? We want to understand the impacts of additional development in this Orange Avenue overlay. The large sub areas we looked at with different amounts of floor area ratios at 60%, 130%, 150%, as well as 200% FAR. The smaller sub areas do include growth, and we looked at future volumes for the year 2040. We also have year 2025, but I wanted to focus our attention today on 2040 since that's a little bit farther out and that will really look at some of the maximum impacts. We're going to talk a little bit about route changes, which ones are likely, which ones are unlikely. We'll go through neighborhood impacts. And some of the tools that we use to develop this information were historic data, primarily traffic counts, ITE trip generation, as well as internal capture and pass-by rates, ITE being the Institute of Transportation Engineers. And we use the adopted Pseudonymous. Our hope is the next workshop in a couple of weeks here, we'll talk about funding options. We'll also talk about the ability to integrate complete streets along Orange Avenue. We'll talk about some best practices for the alignment of Palmetto, and then a summary of other changes in the area, mainly the work that the state and the city have planned for Orange Avenue, just the other side of Orlando, or the other side of Orlando Avenue, as well as Clay Street and the roundabout there they have planned there. So, and some key findings here are that trips that either start or stop within the overlay district represent about 8 to 17% of the total trips that are on Orange Avenue. Whereas trips that are just passing through Orange Avenue represent somewhere between 65 and 85% of the total trips. So most of the trips, and in some times of day, like early morning, the vast majority of the trips on Orange Avenue are not starting or stopping within the corridor. So I skipped one, there we go. So where are they coming from and going to? Well, pretty far it turns out. Over 70% of the trips are over 5 miles long. And so the two circles that you see here, one is like a 5-mile radius and the other is a 10-mile radius. And those really give you an idea of the scale of what we're talking about here. So if 70% of the trips are outside of that smaller circle, that means they're coming from places like Altamont, Castleberry, Winter Springs, things like that. Some of them might be coming from the southwest area, but again, 70% is a big number. That 10-mile distance, once you go beyond 10 miles, well, now we're talking about another, around 40% of the trips are farther than 10 miles away. That gets you into like Oviedo, which is pretty far away from Winter Park. So again, you got about 30% that are within that 5-mile distance, another 30% that are 5 to 10, and then a little bit more than 30% that are more than 10 miles away. So some long trips here. All right, I think I pushed the next button. There we go. All right, so what about the development that we were talking about? And this is I think what you asked about just a second ago. So for sub areas A, B, E, G, and K, we ended up adding approximately an additional 150,000 square feet through year 2040. For sub area F, there were no changes because that's the baseball stadium, and we assume that the baseball stadium will remain. The total development that we added for the different development assumptions for sub areas D, I, and J are shown to your right. At 60%, we're adding a total of 100 multifamily dwelling units, 40,000 square feet of office, as well as just over 100,000 square feet of retail. And you can see the different totals for 130% FAR, 150% FAR, and 200% FAR. Again, we did work with staff directly to come up with these numbers, not only for the smaller sub areas, but also for the large sub areas.
And does your FAR mic exclude the parking garages, or does it include the parking garages?
The FAR includes the parking garages, right?
Thank you, Mark.
So what does that look like with trip generation? So at 60%, we're looking at somewhere around 5,000 daily trips. And all the way up to 200% where you're up over 13,000. We're at like 13,700. now. So you take the initial trip generation, and then we've applied internal capture, which means that since this is multi-use, there will be some trips that go from the multifamily to the retail and vice versa. We've also accommodated for pass-by, right? The amount of vehicles that are already on the road that will go to the retail sites. And pass-by, you only apply it to the retail. There's no multifamily office. Nobody's just on the road and then stops in at an office. So after all those reductions were taken, these are the numbers that you come up with for trip generation.
Okay.
So now let's spend a little bit of time talking about what do we do with this trip generation and how should we think about it. So the first thing we need to understand is that most of the data come from suburban surveys and rural surveys. So if you add a new development somewhere where there isn't too much else going on, it's fairly predictable to figure out what would happen and how many new trips are going to be associated with that development. Another thing that's in contrast to that, here along Orange Avenue, we already saw that most of the trips on the road are associated with other areas. They're coming from and going to other places. As much as 70% are not stopping, or minimum of 70% are not stopping. They're kind of cut through trips. We also know that the network capacity is limited, and I'll spend a little bit more time on that. But the fact is, if more people want to get here, they can't because the roads are already backed up. That's certainly going to be the case 20 years from now. That's often the case during peak hours now, but the amount of available capacity has a limit. Something else I want to point out is that retail trips, right, which make up a big portion of that number, generally have a shorter trip length because not very many people are going to go past one of a certain type of retail. Let's say it's a convenience store, and go past one to go to the next one. And I don't think we'll have very many convenience stores on this corridor, but that's just a quick way of kind of picturing that retail trips typically don't pull people from too far away. Certainly like a boutique or specialized shop will, but to assume that we're going to have 500,000 square feet of specialized retail is not likely. So that's an important point. Something else that we need to realize is that we're talking about 20 years out with a fairly large shift of development. So a lot of things are going to change in that amount of time with the locations that people live and work. This is very much related to the limited network capacity. So if people have a general tolerance of how much time they're willing to spend in a vehicle, as that amount of time goes up, they might not be willing to take a job or buy a house in those same locations. So when you talk about 20 years, that's plenty of time for a lot of those decisions to be made on individual levels. And as a result of that, it doesn't make any sense to just add that trip generation total to the background traffic. Okay, that if we were to flip a switch and suddenly all the development was there, and all those people had places to live and work, then maybe you could, but that's just not the case because everything kind of happens at an incremental level. And a lot of these changes, again, if we're talking about 20 years, it's going to take some time, and there will be quite a few shifts in behavior and patterns. And with over 70% of them being cut through traffic, most of that shift will occur with out-of-town trips. So several of those vehicles that are traveling in from places like Oviedo are no longer going to travel on Orange Avenue. So that brings up the question, well, what roads are they going to take? And we'll cover that a little bit later, especially when we think about the neighborhoods. I've got some slides that kind of zoom in and show some of the options. Oops, so roads that are going to be impacted, and I just blazed past the map of the sub areas. So I'm sure that you are quite familiar with these different sub areas, but sub area D affects Orlando Avenue as well as Orange. And then Palmetto and Cypress will provide local access. Sub area I, the main roads that will feed that sub area are Orange Avenue as well as Denning and Minnesota Avenue. With sub area J, the frontage is along Fairbanks as well as Denning. And then you can get to and from there from Orange, but it's not direct. You've got to take Capon and Holt. So those will provide some of the local trips, access points. All right, background traffic. What sort of historic trends have we seen? Well, there is a lot of data on historic trends. And so what's important, once you boil that down, right, is a lot of times the first available year was as far back as 1999, or even sometimes we actually, for Orange Avenue, we had 1988, but then there was no information after that. So just a really quick detour. What were you doing in 1988? I won't hold for answers there, but the volumes on Orange Avenue were almost the same as they are today. So Bronx was in preschool. Orange Avenue had 18,000 vehicles per day. You know, what did it have? How many vehicles were there on Orange Avenue last year? 18,000. That speaks volumes to me. If you look back 20 years and there's almost no change, then that significantly increases the chances that you can look forward 20 years and see almost no change. As long as we're talking about a developed area like Winter Park. All right. Again, if we saw no change out in the middle of nowhere, well, that doesn't really mean anything that other than it hasn't developed yet. Well, Winter Park has already seen development. It was one of the earlier cities that was here, and so that's useful information. Minnesota Avenue did see a bit of a jump. We only had 2 years of count data available for Minnesota, and it kind of jumped from 1 year from I think in 2014 there was a bit of a spike. Fairbanks, fairly constant in the past 20 years. Morse hasn't changed too much since 2011. Clay Street has seen some growth, but 2% is that's a typical amount, and so nothing too scary. And that puts it at around 12,000 vehicles per day. Just to give you some context, the capacity for a road like Clay Street is somewhere around 19,000 vehicles per day. It really depends on the intersections, as well as the peaking characteristics, right? Like, are all of the vehicles traveling there just during your rush hour, or are they spread throughout the day? So, but right around 18,000 is a decent rule of thumb for a road like that. So even if it continues to, if volumes on Clay Street continue to grow, there's some room to accommodate them. Orlando Avenue, 1792. That's another road where we look pretty far back, and there are certainly are some ebbs and flows to the background traffic, but it's remained relatively constant around 40,000 vehicles once you get north of Orange Avenue. There's a little bit lower volumes between Princeton and Orange. Denning, similar to Clay, we saw some growth, but again, if you're looking at 5,000 vehicles per day, there's no capacity concerns with a number like that. I mean, if that doubles, you've still got plenty of capacity left on it. So next up, we're going to focus directly on Orange, just to kind of drive this point home a little bit more of what we've seen for trends. Oh, back up. So with Orange Avenue, if we started in year 2015 and only looked until 2018, right, it would look like, holy cow, volumes are going to hit 30,000 really soon. But then if you look farther back, you're like, oh, okay, well, it's just kind of sort of reaching equilibrium. And then if you look at 2019, it kind of went down a little bit from 2018. Now, 2020, no comment, right? Asterisk. No, 2020 is not a good year to look at data, probably of many kinds, if you're trying to find a trend or like a normal pattern. So, but I do expect, based on this, that if we look at in 2021, we'll be somewhere around that 17,000, maybe 18,000 vehicles per day. And I expect that to continue because the road's already at capacity. And if there's more demand, that will really just push people to take other routes. I mentioned this before, that future congestion is anticipated throughout the area and really throughout the region. If we zoom this map out, you'll see more red meaning congestion, okay? Orange was getting closer, right? So a volume to capacity ratio of about 80%. So those are roads where if you pull up to a light and it's red, you're probably gonna go through it once it turns green, most likely, but every now and then you might get caught. The red roads, you're most likely not going to make it through. So that's just one quick way to think about a map like this. And the point is, there's a lot of red. There's a lot of roads that are congested. If most of the trips on Orange Avenue are cutting through and it's hard to get there, then those trips will either change, they will change their trip making behavior in a number of ways, either traveling at different times or taking different routes. Something else that's noteworthy through here that I don't know, really it shouldn't be surprising, but it's just I've thought of I-4 as a congested road for so long that it's interesting to think that in 2040 it might be okay. At least through this area. It gets congested again downtown by 2040, but this is something that we can certainly zoom out for a larger area and show what the thoughts are. But again, many of the roads in the overall region, not just Winter Park, but the region, are going to be congested in the future. So we looked at historic growth, which you see here in the second column where this says trend annual growth. That's the historic measured information. We also looked at model annual growth. So if you take the travel demand model, the regionally adopted travel demand model, and look at growth that happens within the model based on regional population and land use forecasts, you can kind of compare the two. And then a typical way to forecast future volumes is to look at different methods like this and then pick a growth rate. And that's what we've done. And so for Orange Avenue, we went with a really small growth rate of 0.2%. Extended over 20 years, of course, that's going to be some growth, but compared to the negative trend, we are moving in a positive direction, and that's consistent with the trend for some of the segments of that road. The model actually showed Orange Avenue decreasing as you go into the future for the reasons that we just covered, of it being a congested network as well as very long trip lengths. So what the travel demand model does is basically balance productions and attractions. And if it assumes that vehicles will take sort of the quickest path available, and then it runs iterations. So once it runs iterations, and once roads get congested, then the next iteration, it'll try a slightly different path. And it does that, I don't know exactly how many times, but a lot. And once that loaded network is available, those are the results that you get. And that's why it takes about somewhere around 4 hours on a pretty high-speed computer to run one for the Central Florida area. So other things to point out here are the volumes on Fairbanks, or I'm sorry, the growth on Fairbanks. We went with just under 0.5%, which is fairly consistent with the model and higher than the negative trends that we saw going back 20 years. For Morse, we did see both growth in the historic trends as well as with the model. So we do have a 2% growth rate for Morse. But again, back to the point about plenty of available capacity that I made on Denning previously, right now the volume on Morse is around 8,000. So a 2-lane road, meaning 1 lane per direction. Again, if you can fit 18,000 vehicles on it and Morse has less than 8,000, we've got plenty of reason to not worry about congestion on Morse. Orlando Avenue, we went with 0.5% annual growth rate. And again, those are then applied for 20 years to get out to year 2040. So what about future volumes? When you plug the land use information into the travel demand model and you look at how that additional development is going to cause changes in travel patterns, that's what we're showing here. So we've got the growth as well as the changes from that additional development. And right now I'm just showing 60% and 200% because to put more on the screen is a bit much to look at. But some things that are pretty important here are that Orange Avenue doesn't change very much. Even with the 200% development levels, the volumes themselves are only going up by about 2,000, around 7% for that segment between Orlando and Denning. And they actually were shown going down in the next segment over. Now, again, that's because it's congested now, it's near capacity now, and the effect of the new development is to cause those faraway trips to choose a different route. So again, the traffic that's coming from Oviedo will no longer use Orange Avenue if there is new development on Orange Avenue. So Winter Park development will push traffic from other cities to different routes. And that's really what we saw on most of these roads. There were some increases again on Morse. We saw a big increase on Morse with the development. But again, if we're at 15,000 vehicles per day, there's plenty of capacity of a 2-lane road to fit 14,000. And Morse currently has 4 lanes. So again, there's plenty there. Morse would be an ideal candidate to think about reducing the laneage based on how it's used. And other points here, clay, we saw volumes on clay go down, particularly between Orange and Par. And part of that reason is that Orange Avenue, southwest of here, which we'll cover in more detail at the next workshop, but Orange Avenue southwest of Orlando is going to be reconfigured by the city and the Department of Transportation to reduce the number of lanes between Clay and Orlando. There's also a proposed roundabout on Clay. The primary driving force for those changes was safety, to reduce the number of collisions on that road, which has a similar footprint to our portion of Orange Avenue. They decided to reduce the number of lanes. And so in this case, that saw somewhat of a reduction from about 10,000 vehicles per day to around 8,000. Now, again, that's not reflective of capacity. If we're talking about a 2-lane road with a capacity of around 18,000, well, 8,000, 10,000 is not forcing people to make those types of choices. Over to Orlando Avenue, we didn't see a whole lot of change. There was some additional growth in volumes, particularly for the segment between Orange and Fairbanks. We saw that go up by about 4% compared to the 2040 base conditions that do not include any development. So those are all of the things that I really wanted to point out on this slide. But to me, this really drove home the conclusion that traffic associated with development on Orange Avenue will primarily push traffic from other cities to take different roads.
And Mike, the question that we have repeatedly had is, what other roads does it the traffic to?
Yeah. I'm going to get to that.
Yeah, thank you.
Yep, I'm going to get to that. If you want, I can just blaze through this. This is 130 and 150 are generally somewhere between 60 and 200, but again, we're seeing some similar changes with not a lot of with about 6% change on Orange Avenue, and then some of the smaller roads have larger changes, but still well within the capacity of a 2-lane road. All right, so potential neighborhood impacts. So we'll start with the gardens, and we'll start with the direction kind of from north is pointed up. So if you're going from downtown Orlando area towards, I guess, northeast Winter Park or Maitland or onto Oviedo or Castleberry or something like that, and you wanted to take this route, to get to Gardens, you'd have to be on 1792. You'd have to be on Orlando Avenue and then turn right to presumably to avoid congestion on Orange Avenue, right? Like that, or take a different route. You could turn right and take Gardens and then go through Orange Avenue and then turn right on Fairbanks. That's something that could happen. Now, how likely is that? And what would sort of encourage that to happen or discourage it, right? And mainly the difference is, well, the whole reason you're doing it is to avoid congestion or to decrease your travel time. So if I can skip this intersection at Orange and Orlando and take a different route and get to my final, well, this is not your final destination, but the point where the cut through is no longer viable at Orange and Pennsylvania, where it comes together, you would do it because it's faster. So when we looked at the delay at these locations, right, the northbound right turn delay here at Orange and Orlando, and compare that with the northbound right turn delay at Denning and Fairbanks, well, you would sit longer at Denning and Fairbanks. So that seems like, let me go back, sorry. If you're making the decision, and certainly if you're following something like Waze or whatever we have 20 years from now that replaces Waze, like some sort of algorithm that figures out what the fastest route is, it's not going to tell you to go this way because it's slower. And if you try it yourself and you have to wait longer at Denning than you waited at Orlando, you probably won't take this way. So if the vehicles stay on Orlando and take Fairbanks, well, then that's kind of bypassing all of the smaller neighborhoods that we're most concerned with anyways, right? If vehicles are gonna be on our roads, we want them on the larger roads like the arterials and not on the neighborhood streets. So that's just one check for the Gardens neighborhood. So if this route still sounds appealing to someone, right? Like, okay, well, at least I get to get off of 1792 for a couple minutes and drive through some pretty neighborhoods, right? So what does that look like if you're in a long trip that goes to, say, Castleberry from downtown? First of all, I-4 is going to work better. So if I'm going to look at this and pick that origin and destination, right, starting around downtown, ending in Castleberry, if I wanted to stay off the highway, I would probably stay on 1792 the whole way and not bother going through Gardens. I-4, once it's finished, is going to be the preferred route, I-4 up to Maitland Boulevard or so. But if you look at this map, the big arrows represent, like, let's say you were going to take this way and you previously liked to cut through on Orange Avenue and now you have to take a different route. Well, you'd probably take 1792 to Fairbanks. You take Orlando to Fairbanks. And the small arrows that we see here, that's just to scale from the last picture. It's unlikely that someone would try to find a small change, a small cut through in their overall route for a long distance trip. Like, there's not very many people who are like, okay, I'm going to take this long trip and in the middle of it, I want to go through somebody's neighborhood. That's just not a very likely scenario. It's not impossible, right? There's nothing preventing someone from doing this, but it's very unlikely and most people won't do it. So again, like, there's several other routes that are more regional. Now, if you're more heading towards Oviedo from someplace like downtown Orlando, where previously Orange Avenue was attractive, well, now 408 to 417 is probably going to be the best way. And for the people who take Orange Avenue, starting downtown and take it as it becomes Magnolia and take it through Clay in that portion that the city and FDOT are going to improve, well, they would not take Gardens because if we go back one slide, Gardens is south of that area. They would have to turn right onto 1792 and then turn left. And that's just not something that very many people will do unless you have an affinity for Denning Drive. That's just a highly unlikely maneuver. So what about the other direction? What about people coming the other way? And this is the same, back to the same Gardens area. If you were to try coming from the other direction, sort of from the northeast, traveling towards downtown, well, now you've got to come out onto Garden Drive and turn left, and that's an unsignalized intersection. So again, with some people do like turning left at unsignalized intersections, but this one is not particularly friendly. Okay, there's a decent amount of congestion on 1792, which would increase your amount of time that you'd have to wait. And there's not enough space to wait in the middle. There's some unsignalized intersections where there's a wide median and you can go halfway and then wait for traffic to clear in the other direction and then finish. Well, you can't do that here. It's too narrow and there's no protected median. So this, again, just doesn't seem like an attractive route if you're changing to drive through neighborhoods and then going up to a place where you're probably going to experience a significant amount of delay. Over towards Lake Midget, for this area, I think that if someone is driving, again, from the south heading towards the northeast, they could cut through a road like Aragon. It's less likely that they'll take Kentucky because then there's even more turns. But if you're going to do something like this, right, with the arrows showing the cut through route, it's more likely that you would do that to avoid congestion at the intersection of Fairbanks and Orlando. If you're just trying to avoid Orange Avenue and not take that anymore, so you're continuing straight through, well, you might take Minnesota over to Pennsylvania, but it's not likely that you would take Aragon up to Denning and then go on from there. Just because by the time you've already decided to go past Orange, you're probably just going to go to Fairbanks. And again, like if you wanted to just take a smaller road east-west, it's probably going to be Minnesota. Next up was Orwin Manor. And in this area, there's really no viable cut-through routes that would be served by this portion of Orange Avenue that's within the overlay district. These roads generally don't go very, they're pretty much neighborhood roads. You can get to Corinne Drive from here, but again, that's not a parallel route to our portion of Orange Avenue. So development on Orange Avenue would not be expected to use these roads for non-local trips, right? Like if people who live here wanted to go to the new development, certainly they could, but nobody's going to use these roads for cut through to or from new development on Orange Avenue because there's no viable route. So what do we do about neighborhood impacts, about those concerns with cut through in neighborhoods? Like what does make sense? Well, I think you should monitor traffic volumes annually. And if those volumes increase substantially or to a point where it becomes uncomfortable for the residents, then it's time to implement some traffic calming measures. It's very important to approach each street and neighborhood individually because they're all going to have different concerns that would result in different solutions. But again, once there is a problem, here's some typical things that could be done for traffic calming. Chicanes, that's where you make the road even narrower. Now, on some roads like Garden, it's already pretty narrow, but you could make it even more narrow in some sections where it's like you could only have one vehicle at a time could go. You could add traffic circles at the intersections. And I'm not saying a full-size roundabout, but a small traffic circle that still causes people to slow down and maneuver around. Something like brick pavers are pretty good at reducing speeds. And if there's ways of reducing speeds, that will typically reduce the attractiveness of the route as a cut through. Also, residents typically, if they have to live with cut through, they at least want people to drive slow. And so another measure is like a raised mid-block crosswalk, something that vehicles would have to slow down to go up and over. But again, these are things that should be considered for each neighborhood individually. And that wraps up what I wanted to say. And there's certainly is more data that we can provide, but I wanted to kind of keep it at a level that's digestible. And then if we want to revisit any of it, we certainly can. The next meeting, I think we wanted to talk about funding options and the remaining things that were in our scope of services for this task that include the integration of complete streets, primarily along Orange Avenue. We'll talk about Palmetto, and then we'll have more details on other changes in the area.